The way that American politics works, there are interest groups and lobbies on all issues. I often say, there's a rule book, and there's a chapter on Israel and the Jews. You just rip out the page from the playbook and you say, here's what it means to be pro-Israel. You learn those talking points, and that covers you in 3 questions you may get in the course of a week on the campaign trail. There is no political space to talk about being pro-Israel as being in favor of a 2-state solution. One of the reasons for starting J Street is for a moment like this, when moments of decision on the Middle East come for presidents and for administrations, that part of their calculus is, can we do what we want to do politically? Will there be political support? And we're here to offer that.
Can I help you?
Hi, Jeremy Van at our staff guy in St. Patrick.
You can step in, please, Majority.
The single address in the world that matters the most for Middle East peace is right over here at 1600 Pennsylvania.
A new Jewish state, Israel, was born in a bath of blood. Jewish troops routed Arab forces from the city of Haifa in the first of a series of battles that were to reverberate through the years.
After 2,000 years, a Jewish nation once again exists. And while there is a rattle of gunfire in the Holy Land, there is cheering in Washington and Hebrew dances of joy for a Jewish homeland that has been reborn.
And that victory is a swift, smashing, and total one. As crack Air Force, infantry, artillery, and tank corps combine to sweep across the Sinai Peninsula to the Suez Canal, east into Jordan, north into Syria. Israeli Defense Minister General Moshe Dayan prays, pledging never to give up the old city.
Is helping sustain the demonstrations. An Islamic leader here calling on worshippers to challenge the army in the streets.
Mr. President, thank you, thank you, thank you.
The peace process never delivered the Palestinian state they yearn for. It is clear that many people now see this as the beginning of a fresh and violent confrontation.
We were more or less at the end point. More or less at the end point.
I think we all know what the basic parameters of a peace plan are. Let's get on with it. Let's get on with it.
The only path to lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians is direct talks between Israelis and Palestinians. Tomorrow, after nearly 2 years, the parties will relaunch those direct talks. Both sides have indicated that these negotiations can be completed within 1 year. And as I told each of them today, this moment of opportunity may not soon come again. They cannot afford to let it slip away.
Thanks.
Hi. We're here for a 4 o'clock segment. Yeah, I can go right to that door to the grand. Thank you.
The biggest adversary for our movement is the status quo. There's a lot of people who are invested in maintaining the status quo, in saying that the way you've always talked about this issue is just fine, the way we've always perceived this issue works for us. And in reality, it's undermining every day the chances of Israel's survival as a Jewish and democratic home.
Commented that we can be sure you are not at MSNBC to be negative.
We reaffirmed that fundamental truth that has guided our presidents and prime ministers for more than 60 years. That even while we may at times disagree, as friends sometimes will, the bonds between the United States and Israel are unbreakable. And the commitment of the United States to the security of Israel is ironclad.
The pro-Israel lobby serves, in a constitutional sense, as a check and balance against the pro-Saudi lobby, the pro-oil lobbies. It reminds Americans of how important the relationship is, how strategically important it is.
I mean, don't forget, AIPAC started because the State Department used to be uniformly in favor of the oil states.
I do think that AIPAC in particular, next to AARP and maybe the National Rifle Association, can wield more lobbying power than any other organization like it in America.
In the 70s, AIPAC had this rather progressive tinge to it, and lots of people were initially big supporters of AIPAC. That's not AIPAC anymore.
They may well represent a majority of the American Jews who care the most. And in politics, intensity of opinion matters a great deal.
You say a single word that can be interpreted as starting an argument against any aspect of the U.S.-Israeli relationship as it currently exists, and you're going to be pounced on. You're going to be attacked.
J Street ought to be trying to work with AIPAC and put pressure on AIPAC so that it is more representative, perhaps, of the larger consensus within the pro-Israel community.
Our problem with the existing voices of the Jewish community and the existing institutions is, where's the mobilization around the two-state solution? Where is the five-alarm fire?
I'm Mark Golub, and recently I had the privilege of moderating an evening featuring two of the major voices on the American Jewish scene with respect to the state of Israel.
You know, the interesting point is that we agree on so much, and yet we're here to have a disagreement. And let me explain for a brief moment why. When J Street was first established, I thought I would join. I liked the words. The words were very similar. End of the settlements, two-state solution, peace. I'm even favorable to the American administration putting pressure on Israel on the settlements, but not on security, on issues of that kind. We agreed on probably 90%. We agreed on the lyrics. My concern was for the music, particularly for the tone. I was a little concerned about the conductor, and I was very concerned about the chorus. And unfortunately, my concerns have only increased over time. You always emphasize your criticism of Israel and not your support for Israel. You have many members of your organization who are virulently anti-Israel.
Name one.
And who use
Name
you
one.
as an excuse.
You always say we have many members of our group who are virulently anti-Israel. Name one.
The ones at Berkeley who refuse to have pro-Israel in their name.
So they're virulently anti-Israel.
Because they won't have pro-Israel in their name.
So that makes them virulently anti-Israel.
Absolutely. Why wouldn't you have pro-Israel in your name?
This is why We view the way in which you advocate for Israel as a chilling factor for people to get involved with Israel in the first place.
Who wants people to get involved with Israel if they refuse to say they're pro-Israel? I'm not interested in having people getting involved with Israel who are embarrassed by being pro-Israel. I have no problem with being pro-Israel and pro-peace, but when an organization calls itself pro-Israel and there is a campaign to get the words pro-Israel off, there is only one conclusion that can flow from it. You have become a cover for a lot of people who are not pro-Israel.
How dare you make accusations that many of our...
There are a lot of American Jews who believe that even those who don't support everything the Israeli government does need to rally behind Israel because the fundamental problem is not Israel's behavior. The fundamental problem is the deep anti-Semitism which expresses itself in response to Israel's very existence. If you believe in democracy and free speech and people's right to have their own opinions, then I don't think it really makes sense to tell people that they can't express those views freely. And it's a moral contradiction that I think is increasingly well understood by many younger American Jews.
I think J Street was the first organization that was willing to represent a big group of people that do not agree with everything the Israeli government does. We launched but a group of people who are deeply pro-Israel and care deeply about it. And so the idea that people should be expected to agree and be 100% in lockstep with the Israeli government just because they're Jewish is just ludicrous.
I came this evening to try to be part of a movement that's trying to bring peace to the Middle East. As big as that sounds, and as a smaller group as we are, that's why I came.
No, this is my first event. I heard about them.
But there are a small but real group of people in the community that don't want J Street to succeed. I think there's a much larger group of people in the community that just don't know quite what J Street is. Should they trust J Street? Why do they want J Street speaking at their synagogue? They've heard these myths, they've heard these rumors. So there's never a point when there's no pushback. There's never a point when there's not someone who's just willing to sort of write a letter and call you, self-hating Jew or much worse.
If it were people like J Street, the Nazis would have won. At some point, you need to call evil evil. At some point, eventually, you gotta call things for what they are, and you can't be a sellout and undermine your own people.
There is no such thing as a two-state solution. Israel is one of the tiniest countries in the world. How are you going to divide that land and make two states out of it? The two-state solution is about the destruction of Israel. J Street supports the destruction of Israel.
Which members of Congress are already considered friends of J Street, and what is J Street's presence on Capitol Hill?
J Street is a threefold organizational structure. We have our lobby in Capitol Hill in Washington, which has 6 full-time lobbyists that's meeting with members of Congress. Independent of that, we have what's called J Street PAC, our Political Action Committee, and some of you might be involved in that too, which is how we financially support candidates who we believe... Well, I'm about to get there. And J Street PAC has 61 endorsees around the country, like Joe Sestak, who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania.
Why are you supporting Joe Sestak? He's an anti-Semite, and he's an anti-Semite, and he's anti-Israel.
So I'm not here to debate for Joe Sestak. This is not what we're talking about in Florida tonight. But I will say that Joe Sestak and J Street PAC's other endorsees stand for the values and the positions that we believe are critical to securing Israel's future, to achieving 2 states, and also securing American interests in the region. Look, I'm not going to speak for Joe Sestak tonight. I think that, but I mean, I think if you...
You're running after
J Street is running after Joe Sestak. He is a Navy admiral who has...
Well, forget the Navy admiral. He's anti-Israel.
Why is he... Excuse me.
You know what? Other people ask questions. You know what? Will you be quiet?
But she's not answering.
Jeff,
relax.
Sort it out and
you relax.
stop interrupting.
Oh, I'm relaxed.
No, you're not.
There are some questions here that are very critical. Obviously, there are people in the audience that came here to challenge, and I will read your questions, okay? There is a difference. You think Joe Sestak is anti-Israel Sestak? I think he's very pro-Israel. So there's a difference of opinion. That's all.
Working on an issue like this is a very glamorous one. But when you get into the nitty-gritty and the stuff that we're dealing with, the legislation, the synagogue fights, all of these things, it becomes less glamorous and more sort of in the weeds, and that's where the real change is made. So it's sort of fighting the good fight, hopefully, on a very nitty-gritty level.
But it's also, a reaction that unfortunately lacks surprise, because this is a dynamic that does happen across the country and across the community. It usually is a limited number of very loud voices that get the ear of a rabbi or of a board president or of the head of a Hillel. Well, I think that we would have all been better served if they had actually come to the event at the synagogue tonight and asked questions. Then we could have heard those concerns.
Tonight's event, as you probably are aware, was meant to be hosted in a synagogue. We have a lot to learn about how much we have to do as a Jewish community in Boston to create a real sense of tolerance for the diversity of views around Israel. And I want to welcome you to tonight's event with Jeremy Ben-Ami, President of Jason, and I can say, we are delighted to see a standing room only.
I think the fallacy that someone could say perhaps we're a Trojan horse for anti-Israel forces is ludicrous. And I think it's a deliberate attempt by those who don't agree with us to try to deflect from talking about the substance of the issue, to try to talk about whether or not we have a list of names of people who are not kosher enough to be allowed into this community. And I think that's a really terrible tactic, and I think it isn't the right way to have an important discussion about the issues that confront Israel, the issues that confront the United States and confront the Jewish community. I think a very important distinction this community needs to make is between those who are critical at times of the policies of the government of Israel versus those who do not believe in the state of Israel itself. J Street believes in the state of Israel. This example at Beth Avodah is, just captures in an anecdote the situation in the community. You can't argue with fear. So many times this kind of intimidation and silencing is happening behind closed doors. The private pressure that is put on members of Congress, the private pressure that's put on Hillel directors, the private pressure that's put on rabbis is part of the MO of the establishment, and their methods are to make a few quiet phone calls that have behind them the threat of intimidation and consequences for not doing what they want you to do. It certainly is not pretty when it is brought to light. Well, there's no big events tomorrow. Tomorrow's pretty laid back, except for a meeting with about a dozen rabbis. We had a meeting in LA of 35 rabbis. I've never been in a room with 35 rabbis. That was really intimidating. I had been obsessed with politics since I was a kid. I spent the whole summer working for the Jimmy Carter presidential campaign in 1976 in New York. And And so that's what I did with my summer as an 8th grader going into high school. Not many 8th graders were doing that, and that just set the pattern. I worked on 7 presidential campaigns, and at 23 was already president of the Upper West Side Democratic Club. I think it flowed naturally from the environment in my house growing up, which was a very engaged house. Very aware of what's going on, lots of debates, always reading the newspaper, watching the nightly news, friends arguing about politics. In 1992, I went to work in Little Rock, Arkansas for Governor Clinton's presidential campaign. When he won, I became the deputy domestic policy advisor, and we worked on healthcare, welfare, education, immigration. And I learned a lot about the intersection between politics and policy and communications. So I just found the give and the take of public policy and coming up with solutions to be fascinating. And it's just been the thing that's excited me in my life.
J Street's fundamental constituency is Congress. The people J Street has to move are members of Congress, and members of Congress are the least politically courageous group almost anywhere.
I'll probably give some top lines, but I don't want to pass out the memoir.
George Kennan once said that America has no foreign policy, it only has domestic politics. In order to do politics in this country, you have to align yourself with a demographic, you have to align yourself with a special interest, you have to work your way into a position of leadership in that special interest, and then make that power felt in the halls of Congress.
The November 3rd schedule. Very nice. Anybody unopposed? We can just check off now. Paulus should be
It's important for us to demonstrate to members of Congress, candidates, donors, that being willing to stand with J Street, to take our endorsement, to work with us.
Rachel, are you available at 4:30 for a quick senior staff check?
That's a winning proposition. And I think we're going to demonstrate that very well.
Let me grab this, but 4:30 quick senior staff check-in just to check in. Hello?
I think we've all actually done a good job of remembering that the most important thing that's at stake for J Street and for us is really the bigger picture. It's what's at stake for the United States Congress, for America, for the role that America is going to play in the peace process. And I actually think there's a great deal at stake there. If, as is expected, the Republicans take over control of the House today, that, to me, does not look like a positive move for the U.S. role in the Middle East and the peace process.
That's the worst part about election days is you don't learn anything during the day. But it's been a year in the making, so I'm very excited. Only poll that counts is today. So. All I know how to do is double things. But, honestly, I think we're going to have a good night tonight, and I think that we will outperform the Democrats.
NPR's Scott Horsley reports on the first day of the president's new reality.
It was a long and humbling night for the president, telephoning winners and losers in the midterm elections. Most all of the losers came from his own party, and Mr. Obama said it felt bad saying goodbye to so many Democrats, many of whom had cast tough votes in support of his agenda.
Are any of the races still officially undecided?
Politicos has Grijalva, Maffei, and Connolly.
There's a pattern of people who are a little skittish about talking to us and being with us who lose.
there's something to it. I want to look more closely, and I don't think we should talk publicly about it.
Yeah.
But there's that courage of your convictions. Like Perriello came within 4 points by being somebody who didn't back down, didn't sound like a politician, who said, you know, this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to stand on. And
right, in a place he never should have won in the first place.
Right, and you know, our folks across the board do well, and there are a whole slew of people who didn't, who were sort of mealy-mouthed and didn't want to take the risk and went down.
Yeah.
So welcome to our post-election wrap-up call. I don't have to tell all of you that last night's election results represent one of the starkest shifts in partisan political fortunes that we have lived through, possibly since the Great Depression.
Jeremy, as the polls show that Israel is not high on the list of concern, is there any political capital left for the president to go after his two-state solution?
I'm hugely disappointed. The fact that the administration has been unable to move the ball towards the goal that it has set out is a stinging indictment, unfortunately, of this administration to achieve what it set out to achieve on foreign policy. And so it's a whole different ballgame today in realizing that what a movement like J Street has to do is not simply provide political cover and assume that the leader of the free world is going to follow through, but we're going to have to actually get behind the president and behind the political process and start to really push and convince these political leaders that the view that we're holding can carry the day politically. So even as the world and the events we experience whirl around us at a dizzying speed, it is our values and our principles that ensure that our feet stay firmly planted in the center of the Jewish community. And it is from that center we will lead.
The creation and almost instant success of J Street was among the most exciting and promising developments in recent years. In my view, the recent decision to oppose the inevitable administration veto of the UN resolution on settlements raises concerns and debates. The action that J Street took is symbolic. You had to know that it wasn't going to affect the administration. You know that the vast majority of the members of Congress that you supported do not support the UN condemnation, and you will put them all in a very difficult position. If they begin to move away from J Street, as they leave one by one, the seesaw begins to tip from your being something special, something both mainstream and left, something formidable because of who supports you, to just another group that says the right things, but without real impact.
Do you feel like it was a tactical mistake on J Street's part, what happened after the resolution and how the mainstream Jewish community responded? Because Aren't you still trying to become accepted in the mainstream?
Well, you know, it's a very fine balance between choosing the moments to stand up for what you believe versus when you're going to incur political costs that are too great. The settlements have to stop. You know, this isn't about the UN, right? This isn't about the veto. It isn't about J Street's politics. But the message has to get through. There are plenty of people in the ballroom today who question the UN decision. And would, you know, that would define them to the right. There's plenty of people who are to the left who, if we had not done that, would have questioned the decision. So I think we are, you know, pretty squarely in the middle.
You favored for Israel, right? For the Jewish people?
We are Jewish. We are pro-Israel.
Let me just tell you one thing. I'm 38 years old. If you talk with a lot of people that got hurt or relatives got killed by Palestinians or terrorists, they have different opinions. I have a lot of friends that died. About 15 years ago, every day was a bomb in the bus.
That's when I lived here.
Every day, and I saw 3 up close.
I was in the Machane Yehuda when it exploded.
I was standing behind the bus, talking with a guy, and boom, the whole windshield was red and black. So how can you do peace with somebody like this? The whole world thinks we do something bad. But the point is, they don't want any peace. They don't want us here. They want us out. You have to live here to understand what I'm talking about. You can't do it from the outside. You have to live here and see.
I always had wondered how my life would be different if I had been born here. The fact that I was born in New York seemed to me always to be a very random occurrence. So I always felt a little bit like I came from somewhere else. My father was born in Tel Aviv in 1913. He was one of the first boys born here. He grew up in a socialist youth movement. It involved Arabs and Jews, and the real enemy was the imperialist British. And then around the age of 18, he had a bit of a conversion and completely switched his ideology. He joined the Irgun, which was the right-wing military faction. He was asked to head up the efforts to get more Jews out of Central Europe in advance of World War II. He negotiated with the Nazis. He met with Adolf Eichmann and saved tens of thousands of people. As the war broke out, my father was then assigned to New York. He was trying to alert the mainstream of the American Jewish community of the danger to the Jewish people in Europe. The right wing really had, I think, a clearer sense of just what danger was lurking in the rise of Nazism. Yet the establishment in the United States didn't want to hear from people who held these views. I think it was a tragedy, looking back, that the Jewish establishment here didn't listen to what my father and his
compatriots were saying. But he died when I was 22, and I don't think I had the time to fully grasp what he had been through. I think it's only in retrospect and in reading his writings and talking to people about him that I've gotten a greater appreciation of him as a person. What he taught me is the importance of standing up for what you believe. That if you have a strong moral core and you believe in what you're doing, you should pursue it. There's this generational flow leading from the pioneers who recognized the dangers abroad and said, we've got to have our own home. And then they built this country. They built an incredible culture and a language and a national identity. And then they had to fight. And I view this generation as the natural successor with just as important a role. And our job is to define the borders and make the peace. After our conference in February, where several members of Knesset came, the full Knesset debated whether or not they were helping or hurting the state of Israel. And that discussion was referred to a committee hearing that was held today. Is J Street pro-Israel or is it anti-Israel? Allow me to be clear. Contrary to the press release from the committee chairman's office yesterday, we did not come before this committee to apologize, but to deliver two clear messages. The first is to reaffirm our deep commitment to the state and to the people of Israel. Second, I come to warn of the grave risk that Israel faces in thinking that only those who hold certain political views can be your friends.
אחת, לגבי הנושא של סנקציות על איראן, נאמר, נכתב, שאתה באופן אישי נטלת חלק בפעילות לובי על מנת שלא יוטלו סנקציות על איראן. אם תוכל להתייחס לזה.
We worked for the passage of the legislation of Iran sanctions. This is one of the misunderstandings and, frankly, lies about J Street.
שנית, דבר שנאמר שהארגון שלך פעל בנושא הווטו האמריקאי להפעיל לחץ על ממשל אובמה, לא להטיל את הווטו.
We did say that if that did not happen, that the United States could not veto or should not veto a resolution that essentially states American policy. For 8 administrations, the United States has opposed the settlements beyond the Green Line.
החומרים הקשים שהוצגו בוועדה מוכיחים שג'יי סטריט צריך להיקרא ארגון פרו-פלסטיני ולא ארגון פרו-ישראלי. ואתה קורא... צריך לאשר את ההצגה. לא. עם ארגון ג'יי סטריט. כמה אני צורך, אני גם יוציא פה את החברי כנסת.
ואנחנו רגילים
להם. אני כבר פעם שלישית, תודה רבה. אבל זוארץ, תודה רבה.
הם אויבי ישראל? מה קרה? הם חושבים אחרת. ואני אספר לך סוד, יש פה כמה... אני לא מסכים עם רוב הדברים שהם אומרים. אז מה?
זה הרצאה שלך.
לא סיכום הוועדה.
זה הרצאה שלך.
Time is running out for Israel, not for the Palestinians. Because at the end of the day, there will be a one-state solution, which is the death of what has been the lifelong dream of the Jewish people, to have a Jewish state that is governed and sovereign by the Jews. It will be a one state where the Palestinians will become eventually the majority. If someone is so idiot to believe that we can keep this status quo as it is for another 45 years, They should remember what happened to South Africa.
Israeli legitimacy in the eyes of the world, I think, is based on the same foundation that any government's legitimacy is based on, and that's democracy. We now live in a world, it wasn't always that way, in which I think democracy is the fundamental legitimating factor for any government. But Israel and the West Bank by no stretch can be called a democracy. When Israel took control of the West Bank after 1967, it found itself in control of millions of Palestinians to whom it did not give citizenship and the right to vote. It established an entirely separate legal regime to govern them, as opposed to the legal regime that governs Jews in the West Bank. And so I think it is Israel's policies that undermine its democratic character.
We're now looking out over the West Bank, the Judean desert. It's near a small Palestinian village, Azayim. And beyond that, one of the largest settlements in the West Bank, Ma'aleh Adumim. Today, the threat is the incremental construction of settlements that will, in a short period of time, create such a balkanized demography and geography that it will be impossible to draw a political boundary on the map, and the two-state solution will be dead.
Any way you want to look at it, I think it's difficult, increasingly difficult, to see a Palestinian state crisscrossed by Israeli highways, checked by Israeli checkpoints, walled off by an Israeli wall. I cannot see that being a viable state if we let this go on much longer. What is it up to now? 500,000 settlers, and probably going to be 600,000 within the next decade if things keep going the way they're going. A solution needs to be forthcoming.
I believe the whole settlement project is a huge threat, strategically, morally, militarily, and economically, to the state of Israel. I see this as a huge march of folly that Israel one day will pay a huge price for.
I think most of you do consider yourself liberal. I don't. I'm a more mainstream guy. I'm an independent thinker. I vote some Republicans and some Democrats. There was a comment made about calling Palestine the occupation. I feel that way, and probably we all feel that way. But you put that on a piece of paper and pursue a mainstream person with that, we're a bunch of radicals. Our primary goal is to convince Congress to adopt policies which will further the two-state solution. So my view is, and I firmly believe this is not a liberal cause. This is a cause that should appeal to mainstream.
I'm not interested in being part of J Street if it's going to be a fringe group. Right. My interest is for J Street to gain traction, to get a critical mass. To do that, it's going to have to be very disciplined in what it says. It's going to have to be based on polling and focus groups. It's going to have to be bipartisan. It's going to be difficult for us.
If we're not going to talk about occupation, then who are we? That's what's going on here. Two-state solution is fine, but it's almost a slogan. I don't want to be embarrassed by the positions we fail to take.
Right. How do we as an organization achieve our goal? If our goal is to move Congress or to move slightly the political equation, I would expand it beyond Congress. I mean, to just change that political dynamic around this issue. Is this an organization where you want to just stick with the words that are right, or do you want to stick with the words that are effective?
I think winning
being effective is a principle. I think it is hard to deal with the reality of a political system. And I think that in that sense, one has to balance one's core values, one's core principles, and what's gonna sort of move us forwards. If we thought our principles couldn't also let us be politically effective, then I don't think it'd be worth having J Street or having any organization.
We caught a lot of flack from the February decision, and we catch a lot of flack from this decision. I think it indicates that we are squarely in the middle, which is where I want us to be, because the goal of any political organization has to be to accumulate political capital over time that it can spend on battles that it thinks it can and should win.
I think there are positions that we have taken that are true to our core values that I think people wish we hadn't, because I think people a little bit wish that J Street was something different than what we were when we started. We were always an organization that wanted to win something very specific. We were always an organization that wanted to be a part of what was happening in Washington, to be a part of working with elected officials. The whole point was that we didn't want to just be standing on the sidelines.
Politics is the art of the possible. I think a lot of advocacy and a lot of efforts to affect policy don't recognize the limitations that come with the democratic system that we have, and the importance of focusing on what you can actually get done and how you can advance your issue and your cause one step at a time.
I don't think we ever sort of close the door on this. Even if it feels hopeless, it feels especially bad, it feels like the facts on the ground are such that it can't be changed, we don't like who's in power here or there, that you don't stop fighting. There will always need to be a group of people, hopefully a large and powerful and loud group of people in this country that advocate for a two-state solution, that advocate for pluralism and justice and democracy in that region.
Folks, myths and facts of the Jewish vote, right inside.
We know that trying to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians is objectively hard, and not every leader is up to it. So I think these leaders kind of emerge in the moment, and I think that we need to construct that moment.
You have the opportunity to be the generation that permanently secures the Zionist dream, or you can face a growing challenge to its future. The only way for Israel to endure and thrive as a Jewish and democratic state is through the realization of an independent and viable Palestine. That is true.
So no one has a stronger voice in this than the American Jewish community. You can play a critical part in ensuring Israel's long-term security.
It's important that we use our good offices to bring both sides together as we have toward a two-state solution for two peoples. Both sides deserve our support. If not us, who? If not us,
I think we can win, and I think if it's not us, this is it. This is sort of the last chance to get this right.
We are at the Mount of Olives, which is the old Jewish cemetery. It goes back centuries and centuries. Our faith and heritage say that when the Messiah comes, the Messiah will come from this direction and sweep down the hill and take the souls of the dead and re-enter over to the Temple Mount, right over here in front of us. My great-grandfather is buried with his wife and brother. And now my parents have been buried here for the last 7 years. So this is my family cemetery in perhaps the holiest place in the thousand-year-old Jewish history and tradition. I don't see any reason to give up this fight. It is a tough fight. I think that we will be defined in the generations to come by how this current argument plays out. It is too important to stop.